Hello, everybody. Professor Barthes here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to Foundations of Western Political Thought. Starting a new series today, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Social Transformation and the Origins of the Left. So far in this series, we've looked at Thucydides, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Algernon Sidney. And today we begin Rousseau, and I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. Rousseau, a French Enlightenment philosopher, moral, political, social, educational philosophy. He was a novelist. He was even a composer of music and opera. Now, it would be anachronistic for me to call Rousseau a leftist. The terms left and right originated from the French National Assembly during the French Revolution, which was more than a decade after Rousseau had deceased. And in truth, Rousseau's thought, as we will see in this series, was complex, it was nuanced, cannot simply be boiled down to more simple modern categories. Nevertheless, as you see in the subtitle to this video, The Origins of the Left, Rousseau, his connections to the left are undeniable. In fact, sometimes I've described Rousseau as the intellectual grandfather or even godfather of the left. And when I use that word godfather, what I mean is in the sense of an originator or a principal shaper of a school of thought. Rousseau, as we will discover in the series, was a forerunner, a precursor to what we know as the left today. He wasn't a leftist per se, but undoubtedly he played a pivotal role in laying the groundwork and setting the stage for the left as it appeared shortly after in the 1790s and into the 19th century. The left, as we know it, would not exist without Rousseau. And in fact, I would argue that Rousseau is more vital to understanding the left than even Marx. Marx is better known. More left-wing thinkers have been directly influenced from Marx than Rousseau. However, Rousseau precedes Marx, and Rousseau's influence is vast. Rousseau's vision and prescription for society, as we will see, blazed the trail that would be pursued by forthcoming left-wing movements in the 1790s and in the 19th and 20th centuries. His views on equality, equity, communal governance, his critique of property, his critique of social hierarchy, his critique of cultural norms and tradition, all exerted vast influence on what became the left. Rousseau, for example, is the first major thinker to assail private property as the progenitor of artificial inequality between man and man. After his death, Rousseau had a profound influence on Robespierre, pictured here. Robespierre called him a divine man. And Rousseau's influence on the most radical thinkers in the French Revolution, again, was undeniable. He influenced, Rousseau that is, a legion of 19th century French socialist thinkers, men who predated Marx like Charles Fourier. He influenced Marx, though the two have significant dissimilarities. And then Rousseau directly and indirectly influenced the left in the 20th century. But here's where things get complex, because there are several elements of Rousseau's thought that deeply resonate with the right. Speaking as someone on the right, I find a number of admirable, almost redeeming qualities about Rousseau, although ultimately the negatives outweigh the positives, and I abhor the negatives. But for example, Rousseau was an outspoken traditionalist on gender, and he affirmed and championed distinct roles for men and women. Those elements on the right that are critical of capitalism and modern civilization will find much to admire in Rousseau. Rousseau often resonates with the far right, and by far right, I mean those who are drawn to the more a more illiberal, authoritarian vision for society and for the right. Rousseau, for example, heaped praises on Sparta, and in fact, with very little effort, a fascist will find much to admire in Rousseau's concept of the general will. Mussolini famously admired Rousseau. Carl Schmitt pulled directly from Rousseau. And so you see the complexity at work here. Rousseau's influence on the right is real, it's palpable, but his influence on the left undoubtedly is more pervasive. In fact, I would say far more pervasive. And Rousseau, at many times, is distinctly at odds with what a traditional conservative would believe. And so I stand by that label that I used earlier in the video of intellectual grandfather or godfather of the left. Now, Rousseau, born in 1712, was a child of the Enlightenment. And as it so happens, he also became a prominent critic of many elements of the Enlightenment. But it shaped him profoundly from a very, very early age. The Age of Enlightenment, this vast philosophical movement on the continent of Europe, elevated reason or rationalism and or empirical knowledge. And empiricism is the idea that all knowledge comes from sensory experiences, what we can discover through the senses. Rationalism and or empiricism as the foremost or even sole source of authority. And this is the means by which all questions, all subjects ought to be scrutinized and judged. That's a pretty, I think, concise summation of the Enlightenment. A very diverse movement, of course, but general consensus around this idea. And human reason was exalted and then applied systematically to a whole range of subjects: science, philosophy, economics, political theory, public policy, morality. John Locke was an early member of the Enlightenment over in England, and we dealt with him at length. But France was the epicenter. And here we see a painting of a salon, debating societies, social clubs where people, men and women, would discuss various topics. Literacy was rising in 18th century France. There were circulating libraries, a book trade, subscriptions for books and magazines, and France was a highly literary culture, and Rousseau was an absolute celebrity by the 1760s in France. 1750s, you got to start 1760s is really when he came to, in the early 1760s, he was the most prolific. There's some irony here. France was an absolute monarchy. Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI. And as the 18th century progressed, France in reality wasn't really an absolute monarchy because the monarch had to work in conjunction with the parlements, and it's a complex subject. Pretty fascinating that the Enlightenment flourished so prominently here in France. Baron de Montesquieu and his Spirit of the Laws. Denis Diderot, who was the chief editor of the Encyclopédie, or the Encyclopedia, was also a very major figure in the French Enlightenment. Also, for a time, good friends with Rousseau. They later had a break. Voltaire, of course, another French Enlightenment thinker known for his wit, his attacks on the church, his advocacy of tolerance as a chief virtue. Rousseau comes of age in this culture. And yet, like I said, Rousseau is also considered one of the early critics of the Enlightenment. And he's often portrayed accurately as a forerunner to Romanticism. Now, Romanticism was a movement that arose after the Enlightenment, toward the end of the Enlightenment, as a reaction to the hyper-empirical, over-civilized, cold rationalism of the Enlightenment. Rousseau was a proto-romantic in the Age of Enlightenment. Romantics and proto-romantics like Rousseau advocated a rediscovery and a newfound appreciation for emotion, spontaneity, simplicity, imagination, for the chaotic and often irrational beauty found in nature, for the free expression of the creative spirit. Rousseau championed the natural, the sincere, the spontaneous, the genuine, the authentic, the unaffected. And the basis for Rousseau's proto-romanticism is found in his view of human nature. Human nature, at its root, Rousseau said, is essentially good. Well, that begs the question, because we see evil all around us. How do you explain evil? If human nature at its root is good, how do you explain evil? Rousseau said, I'll tell you how. Society, institutions. It is society and institutions that corrupt human nature. The individual in a state of nature, Rousseau says, is neither depraved nor immoral. In fact, in a pure state of nature, Rousseau says, the individual exists outside of morality. He is untainted, uncorrupted. Thomas Hobbes, who we analyzed at length 2 years ago, I believe, a year and a half ago, Hobbes, as you may remember, argued that society, and specifically Leviathan, that society saves the individual from his own depraved nature and from the depravity of others. The man in a state of nature life is nasty, brutish, and short. And that's just how natural man is. Depravity is innate in man, and society rescues man from that depraved state. Rousseau says no, it is society that corrupts. In fact, Rousseau says it is only in society that we can become corrupt. How? Why? How does Rousseau justify this? Well, he says that in society, when we are around others, especially a highly civilized society, the individual is driven by this very strong desire, this impulse for social approval. We want to be esteemed by others. And in order to win that approval, we adjust our behavior accordingly and conform to the various norms of society. The problem, Rousseau says, is that in so-called civilized society, those norms have been fashioned by and for the few, the rich, and the powerful in order to dominate and oppress the many. We'll look at this in detail in later videos in this series. I'm just giving you the general synopsis here. But Rousseau says all of the evils described by Hobbes, the brutishness and rapacity of man, they are not the result of nature. They are the result of corrupt society. This is also in stark contrast to Thucydides, the very first thinker we looked at in this series. Thucydides had a very tragic conception of human nature. According to Thucydides, when you strip away institutions, when you peel back the veneer of civilization, you reveal the raw, depraved human nature that lies underneath. You may remember when he told the story, Thucydides, of the civil war in Corcyra. Human nature laid bare. That's what happens when you strip away institutions, and it's nasty. Society, civilization, according to Thucydides, tempers that depravity, improving man and our living conditions. Okay, and the Bible and much of Western philosophy through the many centuries echoes this same view of man, compared to Rousseau. And Rousseau says, when you strip away the structures, when you strip away the institutions, actually what you'll find is an uncorrupted human being. Look at these quotes from Emile, Rousseau's famous tract on education. God makes all things good. Man meddles with them, and they become evil. Everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. So here we see Rousseau's view of the process of corruption, and it's something that begins good, and then society, man in society, corrupts them. The opening words in Social Contract, published in 1762, read, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." The problem, Rousseau says, is not with human nature. The problem are the artificial, society-imposed constraints and bad, corrupt, malignant institutions that suppress or hold down our otherwise limitless potential. Now, contrary to popular belief, Rousseau does not endorse a return to the woods. It's true, in Rousseau, we do find a romanticized portrayal of primitive man, the noble savage. But truly, Rousseau utilizes that concept of the noble savage as more as a standard or a benchmark from which he then critiques contemporary society. Society and civilization, in Rousseau's mind, are not inherently bad. They could, theoretically, Rousseau says, be forces for good. And so Rousseau doesn't endorse the outright abolition of society and of civilization. Instead, he endorses social transformation. A new man in a new society in which freedom and a new morality dominate. It is possible, Rousseau says, to replace our present corrupt society with one that optimizes freedom, justice, brotherhood, and morality. And one of the ways to achieve that is through the state. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. And in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. But if you have dissenters, and Rousseau says this, whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. This is one of the more well-known and you can say maybe even notorious parts of his book on the social contract. Sounds a little bit like Robespierre, who was deeply influenced by Rousseau. Robespierre later endorsed the despotism of liberty. The despotism of liberty against tyranny, and used that to justify his reign of terror in 1793 and 94. And so critics of Rousseau's general will have said, on the one hand, yes, it puts the people at the forefront, but in doing that and in exalting the people, the individual is left behind, becomes an afterthought, and actually gets is steamrolled in the process. So we'll go into all of this, but there you have it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was born in 1712 in Geneva, Switzerland. His mother died just 9 days after he was born. He was raised by his father, Isaac, who was a watchmaker and citizen of Geneva. When Rousseau was 16 years old, he ran away from home and converted to Roman Catholicism and lived in Savoy. He became a steward to a noblewoman who was about 13 years his senior. She was also his lover and introduced Rousseau to the latest, most fashionable philosophy and ideas in France, including radical thinkers like Voltaire. In 1742, at the age of 30, Rousseau made way to Paris. There he met another young man, Denis Diderot, the chief editor of the Encyclopedia, and the two of them together helped to establish a new core of radical intellectuals in Paris, and Rousseau soon gained a reputation as the most original and eloquent among them. He contributed articles to the Encyclopedia on a whole range of topics, including music, political theory. Rousseau, as I mentioned earlier, wrote music. In fact, he composed an opera in 1752 that was widely acclaimed and was even admired by King Louis XV. But Rousseau really got his name in 1750 when he won first prize in an essay contest by the Academy of Dijon. And the name of the title of the essay was "A Discourse on the Arts and Sciences." Now, the prompt of the essay competition was this, quote, "Has the rebirth of the arts and sciences contributed to the purification of the morals?" End quote. Rousseau answers in the negative. He says no. So-called progress in the modern age has not improved people. In fact, it has radically corrupted them. He said, look at all this. We think we're so civilized. Has this really, what you see here, the so-called high society and civilization, has this truly made us a more moral people? I don't think so, Rousseau argued powerfully and quite eloquently in this essay, sometimes called the First Discourse, and the essay made him famous in 1750. 5 years later, in 1755, he published his second discourse, called Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. This, too, was for an essay contest with the Academy of Dijon. And the prompt of the essay competition was this, quote, "What is the origin of the inequality among men, and is it justified by natural law?" End quote. Rousseau says, we'll look at, we're going to look at the first discourse in part 2 of this series. We're going to look at the second discourse in part 3 of this series. So we'll get into all this. But in short, Rousseau gives this account of human beings from the state of nature to high society and civilization. And he argues that the leaders of society have essentially conspired to produce artificial inequality. And in Rousseau's mind, it was the introduction of private property. That was the fatal step. And then civil government arose as a conspiracy of the rich to protect their private holdings. So essentially, a fraudulent social contract. That's the origin of inequality, according to Rousseau. We'll look at that in part 3 of the series. Rousseau in the 1750s, for 2 years, moved back to Geneva. He actually left Catholicism and rejoined the Protestant church, but soon became jaded by that, returned to Paris in 1756. Then in 1761, he published a best-selling novel, Julie. It's one of his best-known works today. However, during Rousseau's life, Julie was far and away his most popular work. And in fact, it was probably the most widely read novel in the 18th century. It was a sentimental novel that focused on love and virtue. Again, this proto-romanticism. It was published in many editions. Actually, Marie Antoinette read the novel. But in 1762, Rousseau published The Social Contract. And in the social contract outlined the ways in which a legitimate government and civil society, based upon the authority of the general will, might arise. All right, not the fraudulent social contract that he discussed in his Discourse on Inequality. Also in 1762, you can see that Rousseau is highly prolific in the early 1760s. In 1762, Rousseau published Emile, which was a novel-ish treatise that described a system of education that would enable the natural man to survive corrupt society. So how do we transform society? We can do so through government, through social contract. We can also do so through education. And we're not going to take I'm not going to discuss Emile any more than what we say here in this intro video. But this Emile was very, very influential. His second most popular work behind Julie. But Rousseau was very critical of just rigid, intense book learning. He wanted to encourage instead the child to cultivate the child's conscience, to encourage a child to be in nature, almost like a free-range, freewheeling type of education. The child's passions should be encouraged rather than suppressed. And I actually read Emile more than a decade ago. It's quite a lengthy work, but I think it was like 700 pages in the edition I had. But it was quite a good read. Rousseau is a very talented writer, for sure. He said this in Emile, quote, "We know nothing of childhood, and with our mistaken notions, the further we advance, the further we go astray." In Rousseau's view, childhood was a distinct stage of life, and Rousseau warned against trying to rush children into adulthood. No, encourage them to be in that moment and encourage them to pursue those childlike passions. Rousseau says, "Nature wants children to be children before they are men. If we try to pervert this order, we shall produce a forced fruit that will have neither ripeness nor flavor, and that will soon spoil. Childhood has its ways of seeing, thinking, and feeling that are proper to it. Nothing is less sensible than to try to substitute our ways. I would like no more to require a young child to be 5 feet tall than that he have judgment at the age of 10. And then last quotes from Emile. "Conscience is the voice of the soul. The passions are the voice of the body. Stop trying to suppress them." Cultivate the child in such a way that encourages these things. Our passions, Rousseau says, are the principal instruments of our preservation. It is therefore an enterprise as vain as it is ridiculous to want to destroy them. Now, the irony in all of this is that while Rousseau was living in Paris, he had many mistresses, one of whom, and this particular mistress was, as it so happens, an illiterate, uneducated laundry maid. But with this particular mistress, Rousseau had 5 children, and he persuaded the mother to give each of the newborns away to a foundling hospital, okay, to an orphanage, essentially. So Rousseau refused to be a father. And back then, these foundling hospitals, for many of these kids, it was a practical death sentence, okay? Pretty cruel of Rousseau. And yet here he is lecturing people about child education. I mean, like, that's one of his big things. You know, he's seen as one of the foremost theorists of education and child rearing. But when it came to his own children, no bother. And maybe for this reason and others, Diderot later had a break from Rousseau, and after the break, he described Rousseau as, quote, "false, vain as Satan, ungrateful, cruel, hypocritical, and wicked," end quote. Harsh words from Diderot. But at least on child rearing and education, Rousseau was sadly quite the hypocrite. But like I said, Emile was his second most popular work in terms of readership and circulation. But it was roundly condemned, not for its views on child education per se, but there was a long section in Book 4 of Emile that put forward some very, very unorthodox, we'll leave it at that, unorthodox views on religion and on Christianity in particular. Now, in that same section, Rousseau just assailed and repudiated atheism as well. So Rousseau was not an atheist. However, that section in Book 4 of Emile earned him quite a few enemies, a lot of enemies, and actually in Paris, the authorities ordered the book to be burned and the author arrested. And so Rousseau fled France and lived as a fugitive for the next several years after 1762. And from this point forward, Rousseau lived in constant fear of arrest. He was in you could say, a state of paranoia and maybe even mental instability during this period of being a fugitive. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, invited Rousseau to come to Britain, which Rousseau did, and only to then conclude that Hume was part of the plot against him. And so he returned clandestinely to France and lived there for the last 10 years of his life. The final decade of his life, before his death in 1778, Rousseau wrote his autobiography, Confessions, published posthumously. After his death, before I do that, I think there's a couple quotes from Confessions I added here. He said, quote, "I know my heart and have studied mankind. I am not made like anyone I have been acquainted with, perhaps like no one in existence. If not better, I at least claim originality." I put that in here to expose the pride and hubris of Rousseau. And don't get me wrong, there was a brilliance about Rousseau. Why else are we looking at analyzing him more than 200 years later? That's undeniable. His influence is vast, and yet here, look at there's no humility here. Well, there it is. He also said this in Confessions, "Whenever the last trumpet shall sound, I will present myself before the sovereign judge with this book in my hand and loudly proclaim, 'Thus have I acted, these were my thoughts, such was I.'" End quote. Ooh, I'm not sure I'd want to do that on that final day. But there's Rousseau, all right? "I love liberty, and I loathe constraint, dependence, and all their kindred annoyances." Rousseau died in 1778, and after his death became a cult figure and popular hero in many sectors in France. His work inspired many of those who brought about the French Revolution. And here's a poster during in the early 1790s, and there's Rousseau. There's Rousseau. In fact, actually in 1794, the French revolutionaries transferred Rousseau's remains to the Pantheon in Paris, and you can visit today. Samuel Johnson, the English writer and scholar in the 18th century, called Rousseau, quote, "one of the worst men, a rascal who ought to be hunted out of society," end quote. Edmund Burke, who met Rousseau while Rousseau was in England, said that Rousseau, quote, "entertained no principle but vanity," end quote. Thomas Carlyle, Scottish historian and philosopher in the 19th century, called Rousseau a fanatic whose, quote, "ideas possessed him like demons," end quote. So, a controversial figure. And yet, I think you're going to be intrigued by Rousseau. It's going to be a fascinating journey over the next few videos. We're gonna dive deep into his first discourse, his second discourse, and then the social contract. And I think you'll enjoy it. So, see you for part 2. Bye.